So your description of this particular individual having basically an identity crisis, I mean, very few people understand what that is. Now, that is not somebody's fault. It's the way it is. If you train to become a physician, first of all, you chose it, you volunteered to do it, and you put all this time and energy into it. It really is who you are. And or we're wired to think that way about ourselves. But boy, oh boy, you touched on a very, very delicate and sensitive topic. So I'm curious to your reaction of what
Yeah,
I'm saying.
uh, 100% agree with all of that. I think something medical school and medical training does really well is it creates guardrails. People know what to do, who they are, and how to be when they're operating or have clear understanding of what those guardrails are. We take physicians who have, a specific training skill set mindset, and we remove the guardrails and say, have fun. And then we wonder why they go completely off the rail.
Hello and welcome to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. I'm your host, Lee Scheinbart, and along with a fabulous team at the CMO Group, we bring you the most crucial conversations in healthcare and physician leadership. The CMO Group is the only physician-run and physician-led organization focused on chief medical officers and exists to transform how physicians lead. The group helps CMOs and emerging physician leaders move from expert operators to enterprise leaders through a unique transformational process. Healthcare doesn't just need good doctors in leadership, it needs high-powered executives with deep medical knowledge, and that transformation is the work of the CMO Group. Once more, today's show is breaking new ground for us here at the Fire Chief. We are about to explore a topic we have never discussed on the podcast. Our guest is on a mission and believes, as do I, that most of us chose a career in healthcare to make a difference. But somewhere between the staffing shortages, the politics, and the relentless pressure to grow without burning out, the mission got buried under systems that were never built for the people running them. Today's guest spent years on the inside, leading service lines across a dozen hospitals, watching brilliant physicians struggle inside systems that were never built for them. And when she couldn't find a solution, she built one. Our guest today is none other than LynAnn Weaver, a transformation strategist, certified high-performance coach, and founder of Healthcare Elevation Partners. Her work connects three things that sustainable success actually requires: practice growth, high-performance leadership, and well-being as the fuel that makes everything else possible. Because as she puts it, when one of those pillars is weakened, the others follow, and so does clinical excellence. And the results of her work reflect it. Physicians grow their performance without sacrificing well-being. Teams go from being drained and divided to trusted and aligned, and physicians finally have the tools to turn adversarial relationships into collaborative ones. LynAnn, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Our pleasure. And we were introduced by a mutual acquaintance, Ethan and Kana, and he thought we might have a few things in common about how we approach healthcare. So
Turns out we did.
yeah, it turns out we did. And his mission statement is put physicians first always. And after talking with you, I believe all three of us in our own way share this philosophy in some measure. Would you agree?
I do.
So why don't we give our listeners a little bit about your background? Tell everyone how you arrived at building Healthcare Elevation Partners.
Yeah. So throughout my career, I've been in service to physicians and healthcare organizations and patients. And towards the end of my time in administration before I left to start my company, I'd started really paying attention to several trends that I was seeing with the docs that I led. And one of those was that it seemed like there were kind of three buckets that a lot of our physicians fall into. One, where they were struggling to grow their practice. They were at higher risk of burnout. They tended to have more interpersonal conflict and challenges and seemed to be less happy, both professionally and oftentimes also at home. And then your middle bucket, where people just kind of kept their head down. They weren't necessarily thrilled or really feeling fulfilled, weren't knocking their goals out of the park, but they weren't suffering. And then our bucket of what I call our high performers who blew their pro formas or their growth goals out of the water. They were the ones that my nurses would ask to have teach them a new approach or provide education. They were the ones that administration would partner with to really create collaboration and create initiatives to move forward within the organizations, and they seem to be happy. And after working with several physicians in all of those buckets, had a situation happen where there was a doc came in about a month after I'd started in one of my service line leader roles. And he comes in, he sits down in my office, throws his badge on my desk, puts his head in his hands, and he goes, I didn't sign up for this. I'm not growing my practice as fast as I wanted to. My wife's about ready to divorce me. I'm stressed with this. Feel like I'm not able to make progress here. I don't have autonomy, and just kind of goes on this laundry list of challenges. And it was clear from my perspective that he was approaching burnout, even though that wasn't a word that he necessarily internalized or connected with very well.
Right. Right.
And so I went and I started reaching out to colleagues across the country to find a solution to help address all of the issues that I was seeing, because it wasn't just him. He just verbalized it in my office. And I couldn't find something. I did Google searches. I spent hours researching, trying to find a solution. When I couldn't find one, I decided that I needed to create something so that I could help as quickly as possible resolve as many of those challenges and roadblocks that he was facing. So he didn't leave medicine altogether, and that we didn't lose a great doc and our patients didn't lose an opportunity to have life transforming surgeries, because he was clinically excellent. And so that was kind of the kickoff point, I would say, for what really spurred the idea of creating this business and having taken several physicians through all of the pillars that we coach from now and getting to see the positive upside. It's just been amazing.
Well, we'll get into the details because I want people to hear about what you've thought through and what you've constructed. But that is one heck of a story. It sounds very personal, both to you and to that individual. That doctor was simply the tip of the iceberg. As you say, he's just the one who came and talked to you about it, but was, and no doubt in my mind, was not an isolated issue. Would you agree? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen dozens and have come across even more, especially since becoming a coach.
Yeah. Yeah. And people will share things with you in your confidentiality that you don't often get in your workplace environment. So that's very powerful and very moving. And of course, this is a common refrain, at least either just before COVID and certainly during it. I didn't sign up for this, or we didn't sign up for this. But I think even if you extract COVID, I think many people would agree with that statement. What I started with umpteen years ago, or what I had in my mind, or what people told me, isn't how it shaped out. And have you heard that phrase more than once?
Absolutely. And that
Absolutely.
story that I shared was pre-COVID. So
Yeah.
I've
Well,
heard it
there you have
more
it.
and more since then, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get into some of the details. So as we're talking about, we're seeing the net impact on people. And you and I talked about physicians in leadership roles, low, medium, high performers within leadership that aren't getting formal preparation. And what do you see most often when that lack of training shows up in real life?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I see it play out in multiple areas, but the ones that are most consistent is you're taking a physician who is oftentimes a top performer, exceptional clinically, and you're putting them into an environment where now they're not feeling as equipped. They're not given the tools that they're actually needed to be able to use to have the outcomes that they need. And they get hit with a different level of uncertainty than they've faced before. They're missing clarity around, what am I actually being measured on? Who am I supposed to be, and how am I supposed to interact with people? I didn't realize, something I hear all the time is, I didn't realize how important navigating politics was going to be in this
Yes.
role.
Yes.
And I have no idea what I'm getting into. And then another one is, how do I speak business? Many physicians that go into leadership aren't given the business training. And so it's not just a leadership acumen gap, it's business acumen gap. And they go in, what is a KPI? I have no idea what this is. Wait, I'm supposed to do what? With how does a financial spreadsheet work? And so there's just all of these questions that come up that, again, as a system, we don't do a great job of properly educating our physicians on that transition period. And so then you start to really see almost this identity crisis come out. So uncertainty, lack of clarity, and identity crisis, where it goes from, I saw myself as a exceptional physician, knowing what I was doing, and now I'm getting all of this feedback, whether it's truly external or it's the meaning that I'm giving to the situations that I'm seeing, because I feel uncertain and I don't have clarity. And now I'm struggling with, who I really am. Am I really good enough? Am I really doing a good job? Like, what does a good job even look like? And you can start to see things unravel. One of my clients that I'd started with 6 months too late into her leadership career, and something that I really prefer to avoid by getting a head start on equipping physicians with these tools, is she came into a new hospital not understanding the political nature, not understanding the key players. Her definition of leadership was very authoritative. In the OR that worked for her in her prior facility, you do what I say, don't ask any questions. Well, she took that same approach to leadership and ended up really pushing out and creating some tension between the primary group that supported her service line in terms of referrals and patient volume. And so that entire service line ended up seeing a significant decrease of referrals because they started sending to a competitor. And then you just watched her spiral. Her health and well-being deteriorated, her marriage deteriorated, pretty much every aspect of her career. The identity crisis was true crisis, and her level of imposter syndrome just skyrocketed. And so it took probably 3 times as long as necessary to back out of that, because she shifted her internal narrative of what she was capable of and how people worked, and all of that negative perception that ends up creating rumination and that downward spiral. And so when we actually equip physicians going into those leadership positions appropriately, we can avoid things like cultural degradation of people being, feeling unsupported, of the physician. Now it's not just impacting their entire team's performance, but her performance clinically also started to suffer. And so the biggest thing that we can do to really support our physicians, our patients, our teams is be equipping those who are put into leadership positions with the leadership tools that are going to help them gain clarity and certainty and know what the rules of engagement really are so they can be set up for success.
So that is brilliant. It is brilliant on many levels, and we'll get a little bit deeper into some of the structural elements and the pillars of the work that you're describing. But I don't think most listeners, and I knew we were going to break ground today. I just knew we were going to break ground, and I'm curious to your reaction. I don't think our listeners, whether they're physicians or not, understand the depth of the existential crisis that you just described. You go give a lecture or go talk to somebody, or in your role as a service line director, and you're meeting a team of physicians and nurses and specialists for the first time, and everybody goes around the room and introduces themselves, and they say, I'm Lee, and I'm an oncologist. I'm Joe. I'm a neurologist. I'm Bob. I'm a cardiothoracic surgeon. You and I in our administrative life will say, well, currently I'm serving as the vice president of medical affairs. Currently I'm the medical director or service line leader. Like we frame it in our role and contemporaneous because we've been in other roles. We might have other roles in the future. But the doctor, like I am a pediatrician. I am me, pediatrician me. And there's no reference outside of that in most circumstances. So your description of this particular individual having basically an identity crisis, I mean, very few people understand what that is. Now, that is not somebody's fault. It's the way it is. If you train to become a physician, first of all, you chose it, you volunteered to do it, and you put all this time and energy into it. It really is who you are. And or we're wired to think that way about ourselves. But boy, oh boy, you touched on a very, very delicate and sensitive topic. So I'm curious to your reaction of what I'm saying.
100% agree with all of that. I think something medical school and medical training does really well is it creates guardrails. People know what to do, who they are, and how to be when they're operating, or have clear understanding of what those guardrails are. We take physicians who have, a specific training, skill set, mindset, and we remove the guardrails and say, have fun. And then we wonder why they go completely off the rail. And oftentimes the system doesn't do the best job of actually supporting them in the way that they need to. I've watched this play out in multiple hospitals, multiple systems, of where, now we'll say Dr. Smith is misbehaving or becoming disruptive. Well, that disruptive behavior came because you didn't provide the guardrails or the roadmap to set them up for success so they knew what game they were playing.
Yeah.
You're putting them in a position, you're putting them into the middle of a game that they don't understand the rules of, and they don't even know that they're playing this game until they're several months in, and then it's too late because now there's been so much negative interaction that it's hard to bounce back.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, let's go further. Let's hear about the three pillars in your work and the approach that you've developed. So tell us about that.
The three pillars that we coach from came out of necessity based off of the story that I mentioned of the physician that really kind of spearheaded the launch of this organization. And it's tying business acumen or business fluency with how do I actually grow my practice? How do I do the things that are necessary to be able to provide this financial security for both myself, my practice, my organization? And then the second pillar is a leadership development. So how do I communicate effectively? How do I understand what really drives human behavior and performance and trust and psychological safety and all of the essential pieces that are necessary to truly be successful in any role, regardless if you're a titled leader or a physician, you are still a leader, regardless
Right,
of title.
right.
And then the third piece is well-being, but not just in the sense that it's not as in the buzzword that gets tossed around all the time. It's well-being as a performance multiplier. I'd interviewed about 100 physicians specifically around this topic and asking why all of these well-being initiatives at systems were not being utilized or not necessarily moving the needle in the way that they were intended to and could. And when you dive into the psychology and the mindset around well-being, I heard a common theme of it's not that we don't think it's important. We know cognitively that protecting our well-being is important, but medical society teaches us that if I put my well-being above patient care, I'm a bad doctor, or I'm not doing enough, or I should, that lovely little word that we should all over ourselves. I should be doing more work or something that moves the needle in a different way. Even though so many people are, and it's becoming discussed more frequently, understand the benefit of protecting well-being, it hasn't created the culture shift within medicine to have the vast majority truly adopt it and embrace it and get to experience
Mhm.
the positive benefit of when I am operating with my energy level optimized. How much more productive am I? How much more efficient am I? More relatable, rational, all of the things that actually allow me to be a better leader. And so we look at it almost like a wheel or really a three-legged stool. So clinical excellence is the seat. The legs are practice growth and business acumen, leadership development, and well-being as a performance multiplier. If any one of those three gets knocked out or damaged, you're going to see everything shift and now clinical excellence deteriorates. And that's obviously not what any of us want. And so we actually teach it as an integrated system rather than individual silos, which is what every other company seems to do.
Integrated systems. Now, we could have about 16 hours of an episode on that. And I really appreciate that approach that you're taking. Nothing's in a vacuum. They intertwine and one will absolutely impact the other. So for a chief medical officer, and we have plenty of those that listen to the show and those that aspire to be in a position to shape change in a system way, how might they think of those pillars if they're responsible for a group of physicians in a clinic setting, in a service line setting? Any advice for a chief medical officer on those three pillars?
I think one of the most important aspects to answer your question is looking at the stage of career they're in, and not just stage of career, but also how long they've been with your organization. For CMOs or any leader that has been with their organization for several years or in a leadership position where maybe they're not practicing or, in the day-to-day clinical operations as much, it's really easy to take that step back and be removed from those daily interactions and be removed or feel removed and not be as aware of what's truly driving the challenges. Part of that disconnect comes from limited time and bandwidth to have deeper dive discussions with the physicians to really understand it. Or really understand what's driving their challenges. And then the second is taking a step back and looking at when I started my career as a physician, what has changed since I started, and the belief sets, the systems, the financial pressures, especially for independent docs. It is so much harder now for them to truly be successful. And a lot of the CMOs that I've spoken to seem to forget about the physician struggling to fully understand it. So, for example, I had shared that description, granted, this was in writing, with a CMO of the three-legged stool. And his response was, I don't think we have any physicians that are struggling with growth. We have a physician shortage. I said, I hear you. When was the last time you sat down and had a conversation with your independent physicians? Because this actually came directly from them. And I'd just spoken with their physician liaison a week or two before, and she rattled off 8 or 9 docs off the top of her head without even blinking an eye of physicians that were struggling with all three categories. And so it's just the biggest takeaway from that is what can I do? What questions can I ask? And how can I actually reconnect to what's going on at the root level rather than what a physician who sees me in a position of leadership may be afraid to share with me? And how do I uncover the true challenges that they're facing today, not the challenges that I had when I entered my first job as a physician?
So allow me to summarize to bring us right to the very next question. So what I'm hearing you suggest is that CMOs, regardless of whether they're new or seasoned, that it would behoove them to figure out in their own style how to deeply connect with the people that they're working with, employed or independent. See it from their eyes, see the world as they see the world, try to understand the pressures that they're under. And perhaps more importantly, and this will lead to the question, is don't forget you took an oath. You're supposed to have a fiduciary responsibility to patients and to other people, taking care of things that aren't yours. And so if all of that resonates with you, here's the question. And if not, then just challenge the premise and the question. Maybe some of those CMOs have not been developed appropriately, onboarded appropriately, given leadership skills. And so I'm just curious about your thoughts about this part of the conversation.
Yeah. It's really hard to teach what you're not taught, and you don't know what you don't know. And especially in organizations that lack structured leadership training or place a high value on leadership development, the likelihood of a CMO not being given the tools that they truly need to be substantially more effective than what they even are. There are definitely natural born leaders that just have that intuitive sense of how to lead. All of that can still be strengthened. And so to your question, I think we see that in multiple areas. We see that in how physicians are trained, and the only leadership that many physicians get coming out of residency fellowship is how they saw their attending handle interactions, and that's their frame of leadership. And it's not their fault that that's all they knew, but once we become aware of what's actually possible, we have that responsibility and ability
Right.
to respond in a way that sets us up to gain the tools that are going to help us help our teams elevate even higher.
Yeah, nicely stated, because it sort of gets into you have and I have observed these gaps. Do physicians in all levels, leadership, director, frontline, performers, who is there supporting them? Back to your original statements, who's teaching them how to lead and communicate, navigate all of this? And just because you get a title or additional letters after your name doesn't mean you're very good at it, even if you think you are. The Dunning-Kruger effect, you overestimate your level of competence, and you have to work and to develop all of that. Back to what you said earlier, I mean, it's not, some people are naturally good, but most of us, and I'm pointing to physicians here, we're good at what we've been trained to be good at, but we've got to relearn or learn new things. So yeah, it sounds like we're very much on the same page. How do you think CMOs might think about leadership development within their organization? I mean, should they be playing a role? Should they be influencing that? Should be advocating? How do you see that, or what has been your experience relative to that?
Definitely advocating and definitely playing a role. in that title, everyone looks to you as that leader and as that person who has the answers. Even if that's not always the case, which everybody is human and nobody actually has every single answer, but there is an expectation. And so, yes, playing that active part as in the leadership and developing leaders of your other physicians is incredibly important. First and foremost rule that we teach is leadership by example. So, who do you want to be known as? Choose 3 identity words, for example. What does a good leader really look like to me? And then how do I embody those 3 characteristics? And how do I bring that into every interaction that I have? Now, back to the point of we don't know what we don't know. How do I continue to grow and enhance my skill set? And then who, instead of how, but who can I bring in who is more, knowledgeable or well educated in these areas that we're struggling in than I am to bring the entire team together so that we can raise the entire ship.
Well, that takes a certain degree of humility, being able to look in the mirror, recognizing that you don't know what you don't know. And there's a great, proverb, if you will. The teacher will appear when the student is ready, but you have to put yourself in the mindset of being a student again for all of that to unfold. So powerful points. And I obviously support physician leadership development for many, many reasons, but certainly support everything that you've just said. And those are great questions. So all you listeners out there who are contemplating this, ask yourself those questions and see what results you get and see where that takes you, and listen very carefully to those other inner voices. You may be surprised. I want to talk a little bit about burnout again. Most of us recognize that what sets up people to experience features of burnout is this workload demand issue. Medicine is not what it used to be. It continues to rapidly evolve. I, for one, remember the days of very short progress notes in a chart. Nobody really cared whether you could read them or not. That's not great. There's a lot of potential safety issues there, but we were able to convey our points, and we would all work in the same, hospital ward and talk to each other. And then things get fragmented and disjointed, and there's more work and more documentation and more work and, more patients, and they're chronically sicker, and there's more of them, and there's not enough of us. But with that in mind, that's the ecosystem, if you will. You made a very clear point earlier about a lack of skills in navigating the system and navigating the politics within the system. So let's return to the physician leader concept, the CMO, the associate CMO, the medical director. How do those people in those roles think about those lack of skills? And while they're working on operations, while they're trying to equalize that workload demand, which is that daily work that you don't see, hopefully, how might they address this skill gap in navigation? Your thoughts about how to address that?
I look at it 2 ways, one for the individual leader and 2 for the team that they lead. And so as an individual leader, it's paying attention to the things that take us out of our comfort zones or the areas that we may be uncertain about, and paying attention to the way that we respond in those situations. So if I'm in an uncomfortable situation where I am asked a question and I may not know the answer to it, or I'm challenged with, changing behavior in my team and I'm not exactly sure how to do it, and I want to be well liked, and I don't want to have to, come in and have challenging conversations, or I call them courageous communication conversations, because it makes me feel uncomfortable. Paying attention to how we respond to that, and then looking for the gaps that, okay, this is how I wish I could respond. This is what I've seen other successful leaders do. And here's something that maybe I can explore solutions for, whether that's through a mentor, a coach, reaching out to another leader so that I can grow personally, because we all see every interaction through the lens that we first see ourselves through, our capabilities, how we view our identity, how competent we are, how capable we are, and through past references or reference points. So past experiences that we've had and the belief that that causes us to have about similar experiences. And so the more awareness, self-awareness, reference point awareness, just understanding human psychology in general, the easier it's going to be to make the necessary personal shifts to take that self-leadership approach and start to shift the team's behavior through seeing you lead through by example. The second is equipping your team. So as a leader, as we become aware of what we don't know, it's also helping, how can I better support my physicians or our entire team and identifying the gaps that they may have and keeping everybody aligned to their purpose and the mission. One of the things that you talked about earlier of, people becoming burned out and feeling lack of autonomy and all of these things are stacking on top of them. I've also seen physicians and C-suite who have taken on more than the majority of other physicians or leaders have, but they are so attached to their passion and their purpose and their mission in healthcare that they don't burn out and they can be working crazy hours. And I'm not saying that's typical or that's what we want to, aspire to, but it's possible. And part of that comes from realigning our identity outside of just the title that we play, but the impact that we make. And so how can I help stoke my team's fire every day and reconnect them to their mission and their personal purpose, as well as the organizational purpose and how that ties together with their personal mission? Because that's something where you start to build better communities among the physicians in your organization. You also start to see shifts in dynamic and the way that people engage and interact because they're reconnected to that purpose and that passion, to the identity that they really have about themselves, the way they saw their career being able to go, and being able to better identify other areas or other gaps that in knowledge or skill sets that may come into play because now they're able to open up and share because they've watched you go through that same process.
So what's going through my mind, and tell me if I'm picking this up or I'm missing it, there's a theme here, and that's about connections, connecting to yourself, maybe back to a former version of yourself, even before you were too heavily trained or too heavily, worked on, and then connecting back to the why. Why did I do this? Why did I start to do this? Or looking at the behavior of those that are deeply connected, almost driven a little bit more than perhaps they should, but it's working. And then allowing that behavior to be modeled and shown and shared and being a little vulnerable about that so that the rest of the team begins to pick up on that. And we can almost by not osmosis, but you're sharing this behavior about being connected to yourself and your purpose and your mission. How does that help other people learn how to do that as well? Am I making sense?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure. So that's really cool stuff. And I think I have one more question before we wrap this up. When we first talked, you talked about, and again, this is more of that frontline physician. And what I mean by frontline are people that are not in formal titled roles, but they're actively taking care of patients day in and day out as they always wanted to. And you've talked to me about sort of high performer, medium performer, and low performer. And then in each one of those groups, it can occur that any one of those can be very disengaged, very frustrated, and then potentially then begin to underperform. Back to how the three-legged stool, if one thing falls, the whole thing falls. It's how do we approach the people that are experiencing those things of frustration and disengagement? Is there anything we didn't cover in this connection and reconnecting about how people might manage that level of where people are?
I think frustration is the difference between expectation and reality. A frustrated physician is still engaged and they care enough to be frustrated. Once we get to disengagement, that becomes a little bit different approach. Would you
Right.
agree?
Yeah.
So let's just tackle the frustrated physician, helping identify what they actually expected compared to what they perceive they're experiencing. Some of that can be done better in the hiring process, in the onboarding, one-on-ones with whoever their direct leader is or their service line leaders on both clinical and business side. The area that I see a lot of systems fail in this is their leaders may not even recognize the challenges that are within their own organization or their system that this physician is not expecting to walk into. And so they don't know how to actually set them up for success. And then
Right.
because they don't see that that's a difference. And so I think that's an important piece of reaching out to other colleagues, really connecting and diving deep into challenges other systems are facing, or working with a coach to identify what are maybe some of the gaps that we aren't even aware of in the way that we're working with physicians, and bringing them on and equipping them with the skill sets And then really looking at how do I start to track and trend the drivers of frustration? And how do we start to change our onboarding process or the way that we engage with them, the tool sets that we teach them, the leadership development training, whatever we're doing? How do we start to adjust that based off of the very specific feedback that we're getting? Some of that can be done through surveys. A best practice that we've put into a couple of the organizations that I've worked with is actually doing listening sessions, bringing in an outside consultant to sit down with the physicians and really drill into the things that are going on. It doesn't have to be long, but it gives people the opportunity to kind of air the dirty laundry to somebody who doesn't oversee their performance reviews, and then taking that and creating implementation plans on here is in order what's going to move the needle the most so that we can support our physicians, keep them happy, and also make sure that we're equipping them with the proper skill set so that their expectation can meet their reality.
Obviously we've both done this work, not together in the same universe, but we've done this in parallel, and I couldn't agree with you more. For those who don't understand this, let me just reiterate this. It is not enough to just listen. You have to put on a piece of paper or in some communication, here are the things we heard, and here's the order in which we're fixing them. And on the 15th of next month, we're going to tell you what we did. On the 15th of the following month, we're going to tell you what we did. On the 15th of the following month, we're going to tell you what you did. We did. And if you don't do that second piece, forget it. You've lost all credibility. You've lost all trust. Now, we do this with the staff a lot. I think healthcare has evolved and we're doing a better job. Not great, not everywhere. We don't do it well with physicians. We just simply don't sit down, listen, and then do the implementation. I don't know why we don't. And when I say we, I mean the universe of healthcare. So I fully support what you just said. And that is very insightful that you have to implement what you've heard. And it may be more than what the physicians are saying. Maybe the physicians are saying, if you just listen to the nurses, I've heard that too. They tell me all this stuff. And if you just did that, that would make me feel better about this, that, or the other. And sometimes it's that shared insight that's really powerful.
You brought up an even more powerful point of communicating it back.
Mm-hmm.
Because something that I hear all the time is I feel like what I share falls on deaf ears.
Mm-hmm.
I raise a concern, then I start complaining, and I never actually hear what's going on. And if leaders shifted that just to communicate, hey, I heard you, here's what we've done or what we haven't done and why, that can change the perception and the experience and minimize the frustration, just that one little shift of communication.
And then there's the old adage to this frustration and this disengagement that the physician begins to think in their mind, I don't like doing this anymore. And the second phrase that they reach is, I don't want to do this anymore. And then they reach that horrible place. I cannot do this anymore. And so that's that same, you got to catch people early and begin to help them through those experiences. And if you don't talk to them and you don't listen, you're not going to hear those inner voices that they're expressing. Well, let me give you an opportunity. Anything else we didn't cover that you want to share? Last words, last thoughts before we wrap up?
I think from what we've spoken about earlier, and just something that I've seen the most successful health systems do, is they prioritize bridging that gap between missing skill sets and where people are actually coming in at. Having a specific process in place to identify those gaps, and then creating a specific game plan. Just like you go into surgery with a case plan, right? You would never go in to operate without, why do we expect people to walk into leadership roles without a game plan? And so whatever step that needs to be for your organization or your system, identifying where those gaps are and creating that game plan to help educate and equip the physicians that are tasked with leading and stepping into the unknown for them. I think everybody will have a much better experience moving forward.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for sharing your energy, your passion, the leadership that you provide for physicians and in healthcare in general. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been listening to the Fire Chief Podcast, the only podcast dedicated to the Chief Medical Officer. If you want to learn more about your own development and the performance of others in your orbit, check out healthcareelevation.com and connect with LynAnn Weaver on LinkedIn. Want to learn more about transforming your career and becoming a Chief Medical Officer? Then connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'll set you up with the CMO group and everything you need to lead in healthcare, including everything LynAnn taught us today. I love talking with CMOs from all over the world, so get out there, be elevated, be successful, be at the top of your game. But remember, whatever you do, in the words of Sergeant Phil Esterhaus, let's be careful out there.